Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Today we continue and finish our discussion of William Shakespeare's works. So, the last years of Queen Elizabeth were particularly difficult for England, simply because there was a war in Ireland lasting. There was a war with Spain in the Netherlands, which began in 1585 and finished in 1604, the year after Elizabeth's death. And there was a severe persecution of Catholics by Protestants. And all this created a very tense atmosphere in the country, especially as the question of succession, of who would become king or queen after Elizabeth, had not been settled till the very end of Elizabeth's life. Quite reasonably, she refused to name a successor, saying that she was not able to love her winding sheet, when put metaphorically, and that she didn't want to repeat the experience of her elder sister Mary, because during Mary's reign, Elizabeth was recognized as the heir apparent to the throne, and this spoiled the life of Mary Tudor, which was not easy anyway, thoroughly. So Elizabeth preferred not to name the successor, and all this brought forth rival factions. Some English aristocrats were claiming the throne, together with Spain and with the Scottish King James VI of Scotland, who would become King James I of England. And as a result, the English people were waiting daily for the long-expected news of the Queen's demise, which followed only in the year 1603, when she was in the 70th year of her age. Shakespeare, as a person connected with the recusant community, couldn't feel comfortable either, especially as after the Essex Rebellion, he and his company had been questioned in connection with the idea of staging the play King Richard II with its pronounced deposition scene just the day before the rebellion. It so happened that King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England. He had the perfect right to inherit because his grandfather, James V of Scotland, had been the grandson of Henry VII of England. So James was a direct descendant of the first Tudor king, and although Henry VIII, during his reign, ruled against the inheritance, the succession by foreigners, this awkward fact had been overlooked because Henry's other administrative pronouncements were quite illogical and harmful for the country. So in this context, it was believed that James was the ideal candidate, and there was no necessity to follow the intricate ideas of Henry VIII. When James became king, the first months, and probably the first year of his reign as a whole, were the time of great expectations. He was the son of the martyr Scottish Queen, Mary Stuart, who remained Catholic till the end. It was believed that his own wife, Anne of Denmark, had converted and became a Catholic, and James also made soothing diplomatic noises to the effect that he himself was thinking of becoming a Catholic. So when James became king, the country was exultant, and during the first months of his reign, he did a lot of things which made people think of religious reconciliation. For example, Shakespeare's patron, the Earl of Southampton, Henry Wriothesley, who had been imprisoned for his participation in the Essex Rebellion, was released from the tower. His goods were restored to him, and similar things were done with other prominent representatives of the English aristocracy. And it was at that time that Shakespeare entered a dialogue with the monarch, understanding that he was an intellectual man who would not be satisfied with pieces of buffoonery at his theatrical performances. And as James had become the patron of Shakespeare's company, it was only natural that Shakespeare, as the leading playwright, would be addressing the king as member number one of his audience. James had been the author of various literary texts, as I have said it previously, and he wrote texts belonging to different genres. He was an expert in demonology, the way it was called, and Macbeth is Shakespeare's answer to the king's investigation of this mystical side and dramatic and menacing side of human life. He was also the author of a treatise called Basilican Doran. It was the text addressed to James's elder son, Prince Henry, whom we also mentioned last time, and it contained information concerning the duty of the king. And Shakespeare wrote Measure for Measure as a play answering James' ideas on this subject. Also, he was the author of sonnets and a longer narrative poem devoted to the fight with the Turks, the episode, the battle at Lepanto, where the Turks were defeated due to the collective effort of European countries. And Othello is a kind of answer to this particular literary effort of the king. And also, James was the author of texts on Scottish history, hence the appearance of King Lear. So these texts were written, the dialogue between the playwright and the monarch was going on, and then it was all finished rather abruptly, because at the end of the year 1605, the so-called Gunpowder Plot took place. People were tired of waiting for James to introduce religious toleration in the country. And if in the year 1604, James really abandoned fines, he stopped collecting money from people who refused to attend the Protestant sermons. When James saw at the end of the year that his treasury was empty, he asked his ministers what was going on, and they answered that in the absence of this regular flood of money from the Catholics, it was only natural that the royal treasury was empty. So in 1605, rather reluctantly, James reintroduced the legislation and the punitive measures against the Catholics, and that was already too much. In the year 1604, again, the war with Spain was finished, and when it was finished, the English Catholics also expected some toleration. They hoped that the Spanish side would demand toleration and milder politics towards Catholics, but the English participants of these negotiations quite reasonably remarked that if Spain demanded toleration for Catholics, the English would demand toleration for Protestants in the Netherlands. And there was little that the Spanish side could say against the logic of such reasoning, and so the whole project was abandoned. English Catholics again find, with no hope of reversal of the policy towards them, became desperate, and in 1605 some 12 enthusiastic young gentlemen organized the so-called Gunpowder Plot. They gathered enough powder to blow up the whole of English Parliament. 1,000 people approximately were to be present, the royal family included. And miraculously, just the day or the night before the opening of the Parliament, the gunpowder was discovered in the cellars of Westminster. And the campaign, the manhunt began, because some members of this company of gunpowder plotters were arrested almost at once. Others managed to flee from London and to hide themselves in the provinces. And as a result, one of the aristocratic houses was attacked, and people first tried to defend themselves, and then they died during the skirmish. So the full-fledged trial began, full-fledged search for criminals. And the interesting thing about the whole initiative was that James's people, whom he had inherited from Elizabeth, staunch Protestants, were very eager to implicate the Jesuit order in the plot. Of course, they were trying to attack the Catholic community generally, but the Jesuits were the target of this investigation specifically. Although the Jesuits had been quite calm during those years after James became king, still James's administration understood the potential dangers connected with the activities of the Jesuits, and so they tried to implicate the Jesuits in the plot. The Jesuits did have some knowledge of the plot, so they had been guilty probably of not reporting on the conspirators to the authorities, but at the same time, they were not the people to have initiated the whole process, and they didn't really know the details because they refused to listen when some gunpowder plotters tried to confess the exact details of the plan during the ceremony of confession. But this was disregarded. The Jesuits were called the chief instigators of the plot, and as they were directly connected with the Pope, the order was answerable to the Pope only. By analogy, the Pope was also implicated, and that was the propaganda coup very successfully carried out by the old administration James had inherited from Elizabeth. And since then, a really serious prosecution of Catholics started all over again in the country. In the year 1610, the French king, Henry IV, had been killed in France. He was the one to have introduced religious toleration in France. And it was said that a lunatic Catholic, also instigated by the Jesuits, which is very doubtful, Francois Ravaillac, had killed the king of France. And James became doubly hysterical. And in this case, there was little hope that he would think of religious toleration, as his colleague who had introduced it in France had just been killed. These were the dark years for the country, for the Catholic community. And it's no wonder that in 1613, Shakespeare finally decided to finish his career, because in that year, particularly strict measures of censorship were introduced in England, and the better part of the playwrights who were Shakespeare's colleagues and writers generally stopped writing and publishing, at least publishing, for another 9 years. And the only person who for some time had been allowed to publish his works was Ben Jonson, initially a Catholic, but he had recanted, and he became for a while the leading playwright in the country. But then even he was not allowed to continue writing. And so it was only natural for Shakespeare to stop his literary activities and to move to Stratford in 1613, where he died 3 years later. But before he left London, as we remember, he bought a very problematic property, the so-called Blackfriars house, which he had bought from some Catholic conspirators, and next day he leased the house to the same people who would lease it yet to somebody else, and as a result Shakespeare, who would be residing in Stratford, would be the first person to be questioned in connection with the potential seditious activities which would take place in that house. But as Shakespeare was respectfully living at some distance from London, it would be easy for him to say that he had got nothing to do with all those Catholic enterprises, and this would give time to the potential conspirators to hide themselves. This complicated variant of purchase was practiced frequently in England, and some members of the Jesuit mission would be involved in transactions of this kind. So Shakespeare, when leaving London, lent his name to his co-religionists to make sure they could live in relative peace and quiet. And to do this, he was ready to protect them and to lend his respectable name to cover the potential plots for a while. That was the end of Shakespeare's career. In 1613, the end of his life in 1616, two daughters remain. The elder daughter would inherit practically the whole of his estate. The wife would be allowed to live with the elder daughter, and she would be taken care of by the elder daughter till the end of her life. But as we remember, Anne Hathaway and Shakespeare, in technical terms, inherited practically nothing from her husband, only the famous second best bed. And then Shakespeare for a while was forgotten, and then Shakespeare after a while was remembered again and would become English playwright #1 in the 18th century, and then the internationally renowned playwright known to the whole world. A couple of examples of Shakespeare's texts written not during Queen Elizabeth's reign, but during King James's reign, just for us to see the evolution of his dramatic talent. Just a second, I'm looking for the papers. So we have two sets of examples, one coming from Measure for Measure, and the other one coming from Macbeth. The plots are not equally familiar to the readers. Measure for Measure is less popular among the spectators, the producers, and everybody else. This is a play addressed to James, connected with the activity of magistrates, so to speak, the duty of the rulers towards their subjects, and it's the description, a very subtle one, of the unprincipled behavior of the rulers who have double standards and allow themselves a lot while punishing people for similar offenses. And Shakespeare tries to draw the king's attention to the fact that his magistrates, his government, who were arguing for harsh measures against some part of the population, were criminals themselves. The idea is that the ruling duke suddenly decides to retire, and he asks his deputy, called Angelo, to rule Vienna in his absence. And Angelo, being a person following those famous double standards, eagerly overtakes the responsibility, and he falls in love with a lady called Isabella, who is quite indifferent to him. And to make Isabella his mistress, he begins to prosecute Isabella's brother, who, as it becomes known, had had marital relations with a young lady, actually not marrying her. And it turns out that there is an old law according to which a person who had pre-contacted a woman should be executed. Although Angelo demands the same thing from Isabella, and he would be guilty of similar offense, he still is ready to kill Isabella's brother if she does not yield. And so Isabella, quite a reasonable lady, tries to argue with Angelo, with no success apparently, but then they manage to provoke Angelo to arrange a kind of secret meeting with Isabella, and it turns out that in fact he had a mistress of a similar kind, and this lady attends the meeting instead of Isabella, and Angelo is compromised, the Duke returns, but the whole thing shows how dangerous it is to entrust unreliable people with power and how they can abuse it. So here we have the beginning of the play, Act 1, the dialogues between Angelo and Isabella. The law has not been dead, though it has slept. Those many had not dared to do that evil, if the first that did the edict infringe had answered for his deed. Now 'tis awake, takes note of what is done, and like a prophet, looks in a glass that shows what future evils, either now or by remissness now new conceived, and so in progress to be hatched and born, are now to have no successive degrees, but here they live to end. And Isabella, following Portia's example, says, yet show some pity. But Shylock at least had the reason to hate those Protestants and Venetians. Angelo has no reason whatever. He is simply evil. I show it most of all when I show justice. For then I pity those I do not know, which a dismissed offense would after go, and do him right, that answering one foul wrong lives not to act another. Be satisfied. Your brother dies tomorrow. Be content. So you must be the first that gives the sentence, and he that suffers. Oh, it's excellent to have a giant's strength, but it is tyrannous to use it like a giant. Could great men thunder as Jove himself does, Jove would never be quiet, for every pelting petty officer would use his heaven for thunder, nothing but thunder. Merciful heaven, thou rather, with thy sharp and sulphurous bolt, splits the unwedgeable and gnarled oak than the soft myrtle. But man, proud man, dressed in a little brief authority, most ignorant of what he's most assured, his glassy essence, like an angry ape, plays such fantastic tricks before high heaven, as makes the angels sweep, who with our speens would all themselves laugh mortal. So Isabella is rhetorical, she is convincing. She says, who are you to speak against my brother and to prosecute him? But Angelo insists that it is his right. And then comes the continuation when Angelo already offers some practical ways for Isabella to save the brother. Admit no other way to save his life, as I subscribe not that, nor any other. But in the loss of question, that you, sister, finding yourself desired of such a person whose credit with the judge or own great place could fetch your brother from the manacles of the all-binding law, and that there were no earthly mean to save him, but that either you must lay down the treasures of your body to this supposed, or else to let him suffer, what would you do? So if you can save your brother by becoming a mistress of an important person, what would you do? As much for my poor brother as myself. That is, were I under the terms of death, the impression of keen whips I'd wear as rubies, and strip myself to death as to a bed, that longing have been sick for, ere I yield my body up to shame. Then must your brother die, and 'twere the cheaper way. Better it were a brother died at once than that a sister, by redeeming him, should die forever. So Isabella has a very proper idea of how she should behave. If the way to save the brother is to prostitute herself, she would choose death, both for herself and for the brother. Quite a clear position, a bit uncompromising, of course, but understandable. And Angelo shows that although he claims the law is everything for him, he is ready to somehow infringe it if he were to receive what he desired. Very much like James's magistrates, who always sort of double standards for themselves, enriching themselves, ingratiating themselves with the nation's wealth and with the wealth of their co-religionists, and at the same time demanding absolute obedience to their power and to the royal power, and thus causing great unrest in the country. So that's the idea of Shakespeare concerning the justice as to be exercised by the king and his magistrates. And then comes a very powerful piece from another play by Shakespeare, Macbeth, the answer to the king's literary efforts and his investigations of demonology. But here again, it's not just the witches that attract the attention of the playwright. The double standards again, the idea that power is everything, and that for gaining it, all human restrictions could be overcome. And thus Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are ready to kill the lawful king of Scotland to become the rulers. And Lady Macbeth is even more aggressive than the husband. But then comes the logical response to their efforts, because people who had initially supported them become horrified by the activities of this couple. The opposing faction gathers an army, they are attacked, and Lady Macbeth turns out to be unable to bear the consequences of her crimes. She goes mad. Finally, she dies, and Macbeth is to face these consequences alone. So, a very good study of criminal psychology, not only of demonology, when a person is ready to do anything to reach his goal, however contemptible and problematic the goal could have been, and then both the society reacts and the own psychics of a person, if we speak about Lady Macbeth, revolts against the bearer of this conscience. Just to give you an idea of what it all sounds like, some extracts from Macbeth, also very powerful, very tragic, very grim play by Shakespeare. Macbeth speaks about his desire to kill the king, but still he is in two minds. He has doubts. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well, if it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his success, that but this blow might be the be-all and the end-all here. But here, upon this bank and shoal of time, will jump the life to come. But in these cases, we still have judgment here, that we but teach bloody instructions, which being taught return to plague the inventor. This even-handed justice commends the ingredients of our poisoned chalice to our own lips. He is here in double trust, first as I am his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed, then as his host, who should against his murderer shut the door, not bear the knife myself. Besides, this Duncan has borne his faculties so meek, has been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet tongue, again against the deep damnation of his taking off. And pity, like a naked newborn babe, striding the blast of heaven's cherubim, horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air, shall blow the horror deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which overleaps itself and falls on the other. So Macbeth says that he wants to do the murder and to do it quickly, but he has doubts. He is the subject of the king, he is the host of the house where the king is staying, and the king himself is such a nice person that if he is killed, heaven would react and everyone would turn against the murderer. But then enters Lady Macbeth, who is ready to support the husband, the errant husband, and to make him do her bidding. We will proceed no further in this business. He has honored me of late, and I have bought golden opinions from all sorts of people, which would be worn now in their newest gloves, not cast aside so soon. And then Lady Macbeth interferes. Was the hope drunk wherein you dressed yourself? Has he slept since? And wakes it now to look so green and pale at what it did so freely? From this time, such I account thy love. Art thou afeared to be the same in thine own act and valor as thou art in desire? Wouldst thou have that which thou esteemest the ornament of life, and live a coward in thy own esteem, letting I dare not wait upon I would, like the poor cat in the adage? Prithee, peace. I dare do all that may become a man. Who dares do more is none. What beast was then that made you break this enterprise to me? When you dost do it, then you were a man. And to be more than what you were, you would be so much more than man. no time, no place, did they not hear? And yet you would make both. And so on. So, criminal psychology revealed the husband and the wife briefly rule the country, but because of their crimes, Lady Macbeth is unable to bear it all, and Macbeth remains finally alone and he is defeated. So, several points concerning Shakespeare's ideas on the nature of power, royal power, are given here. And Shakespeare knows enough of human psychology to understand the psychology of a criminal, but he always speaks about the consequences. And this is a mildly optimistic and very humanistic approach to what he is speaking about: crime and punishment, the nature of mercy, the necessity for the ruler both to be powerful and good. These are the things that Shakespeare manages to combine with the study of individual characters in this particular play and in many other texts. And this combination of tackling truly philosophical complication questions of the nature of power with the description of the everyday behavior of a person makes Shakespeare really a great playwright, a great writer, superior to so many other of his contemporaries, his predecessors, and his successors. The ability to study both the life, the private life of a person, and the ability to raise very abstract philosophical questions. As I said it last time, I have devoted so much time during this course of lectures to Shakespeare, simply because, first of all, he deserves it, and also because without explanations, it's very difficult to misunderstand him and to underestimate him. Without the knowledge of the epoch and the details of Shakespeare's biography, it's very difficult to understand what he had written. So I allowed myself such a long explanation of the main ideas of Shakespeare's works. We have very little time left. I have chosen this way of lecturing deliberately. And now we pass on to the other writers. One of them, Shakespeare's contemporary, John Donne, and then John Milton, because it will show the continuation of English literature, the tradition of writing classic poetry in English in the 17th century and onwards. Please have a look at the two sheets of paper I have sent to you today. So it would be John Donne and John Milton. John Donne, as we see, was born only 9 years after Shakespeare was born. There is the misdating in this sheet of paper. In fact, he was born in 1573 in January, but as in those times the year finished in March, technically, according to the then calculations, it was the year 1572, which was to finish in March of what we now consider 1573. So the misdating is understandable, but now, according to modern calculations, it was the year 1573. He was born in the same epoch as Shakespeare. He belonged to a devout Catholic family. Some members of the family had been executed, and John Donne, for some time, was living in the capacity of a recusant, but then he converted. He was accepted as the member of the Anglican Church, and then he was the head of St. Paul's Cathedral and occupied a prominent place in the church hierarchy. He was, and he is, a writer, rather controversial, with tendency sometimes to describe human life and human relations in the provocative manner. And in this sense, he belongs to another generation of poets compared to William Shakespeare. There are a lot of things written about him in the 20th and in the 21st centuries, simply because he was actively propagated by our compatriot Joseph Brodsky. He was placed in the category of the so-called metaphysical poets, and his philosophical, religious views and views on the nature of human life seemed quite attractive to mavericks like the great compatriots, like the great compatriot of ours. The pleasing, the pleasant aspects of human life are skillfully intertwined in his poetry with the more tragic aspects of it. There are people who love his poetry, there are people who find it very difficult to enjoy him, but as he really belongs to classic English poetry, I decided to introduce some examples. The biography, as we see, is reflecting the then situation in the country, and the fact that finally he recanted and became a Protestant again shows the main tendencies of the life of so many intellectuals in Elizabethan and then in the Jacobean England. People simply became tired of resisting, and then they could show the unenviable sides of their character, the desire and the readiness to conform and to disregard the glorious history of their families. Some examples of John Donne. Maybe someone will appreciate what we see now. Come live with me, and be my love, and we will some new pleasures prove, of golden sands and crystal brooks, with silken lines and silver hooks. There will the river whispering run, warmed by thy eyes more than the sun, and there the enamored fish will stay, begging themselves they may betray. When thou wilt swim in that life bath, each fish which every channel has will amorously to thee swim, gladder to catch thee than thou him. If thou to be so seen best close, by sun or moon thou darkness both, and if myself have leave to see, I need not their light having thee. Let others freeze with angling reeds, and cut their legs with shells and weeds, or treacherously poor fish beset with strangling snare, or window net. Let coarse, bold hands with slimy nest, from slimy nest, the bedded fish in banks outrest, or curious traitors, sleeve silk flies, bewitch poor fish's wandering eyes. For thee, thou needst no such deceit, for thou thyself art thine own bait. That fish that is not catched thereby, alas, is wiser far than I. Oh, do not die, for I shall hate all women so when thou art gone, that thee I shall not celebrate when I remember thou wast one. But yet thou canst not die, I know. To leave this world behind is death. But when thou from this world will go, the whole world vapors with thy breath. Or if, when thou, the world soul, goest, it stay, 'tis but thy carcass then, the fairest woman, but thy ghost, but corrupt worms, the worthiest men. The opposite feelings, the opposite emotions, the pleasure of love and the tragedy of death. The last poem. As virtuous men passed mildly away and whispered to their souls to go, where some of their sad friends do say, now his breath goes, and some say, no. So let us melt and make no noise, no tear floods, no sigh tempests move. 'Twere profanation of our joys to tell the later our love. Moving of the earth bring harms and fears. Men reckoned what it did and meant, but trepidation of the spheres, though greater far, is innocent. Dull sublunary lovers' love, whose soul is sense, cannot admit of absence, cause it does remove the thing which elemented it. But we by love so much refined, that ourselves know not what it is, intershod of the mind, careless, eyes, lips, and hands to miss. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion, like gold to Eretzinus beat. If they be two, they are two so, as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but does if the other do. And though it in the center sit, yet when the other far does roam, it leans and hearkens after it, and grows erect as that comes home. Such wilt thou be to me, who must, like the other foot, obliquely run. Thy firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I began. A lot of poems of this kind, a very rich heritage left by John Donne as a preacher. His sermons, when he became an Anglican priest, the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, were very popular, and there might be some among you who will like his poetry. He died the honorable member of the Anglican Church, the author of those beautiful and controversial poetic texts and of fiery sermons propagating the Protestant cause in England. John Milton belongs to another generation. It's obviously the 17th century already, and he is the author of the most famous text, Paradise Lost, which was considered for a time superior to Shakespeare's works. And he's famous not only for his literary efforts, but for his political views. He was born during the reign of King James already, no experience of the recusant kind in his biography, and he was just 17 when King James I died. The successor of King James, King Charles I, grew up with a very convenient idea of his own supremacy, but the idea was at the same time very dangerous for a person who was to rule the nation deeply divided by the oncoming conflicts between the royal power and the members of the local gentry and the merchants who had tasted the freedom of some kind they enjoyed because the Protestant Church was supporting such kind of people. And as the importance of the parliament was also growing, it was first supported by Henry VIII, who just wanted the parliament to be a convenient tool in his hands in fighting the Roman Catholic Church. So the parliament was asked various questions concerning the legitimacy of the church, and the king gave answers that suited him. But the parliament was becoming increasingly influential in the country since Henry VIII first addressed it with such important questions. And then during the reign of Elizabeth, the parliament was increasing its significance because the members of the parliament either voted for giving subsidies to the sovereign, or they would be abstaining from doing it. And then King James, who was not accustomed to consulting any forces within the country, with the exception of the highest aristocracy, was finding it increasingly difficult to cooperate with his parliaments, and the parliament generally became the plague of the king's existence. But still, James was an experienced politician with the experience of fighting various factions in his native country, Scotland, before he became King of England. Charles I didn't have such an experience, and he grew up with an idea that his power, in fact, was absolute. And this was the idea firmly rejected by some very important people in the land. And it is with the reign of King Charles I that the so-called revolution of the middle of the 17th century is connected, because at some point the powerful merchants, the gentry, not the highest aristocracy, began to fight with the king in earnest, and for 7 years, beginning with the year 1642 till the year 1649, the war between the parliament and the king was going on, and it all ended up in the execution of Charles I, carried out by people headed by Oliver Cromwell. And then the so-called interregnum emerged, the years when the parliament was ruling the country, headed by Oliver Cromwell, and those were the years between the execution of Charles I and the so-called restoration, when his son, Charles II, became King of England. Those 11 years were spent by England first under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, but he died in the year 1658, 2 years before the restoration of Charles II. And after his death, it became clear that the successors of Cromwell would not be able to control the country any longer. hence the restoration which took place. John Milton actively participated during those years in the political life of England. He received very good education, he traveled extensively, and he was quite a grown-up man when in 1642 he joined the parliament, and he was ready to write pamphlets against the king. And then when Oliver Cromwell came to power, Milton was responsible for some aspects of the diplomatic service of England, and he wrote some pamphlets and some juridical documents, and carrying out a great work on translation, because he was fluent in various languages, Latin included. And all these activities were aimed at supporting the power of the Parliament of Oliver Cromwell. And in his Paradise Lost, there is this very powerful description of a rebellion of man against God, or the rebellion of the fallen angel, Satan, against God, and this idea of the free will of a person in revolt against his creator is shown. And John Milton was a convinced follower of the idea of the legitimacy of tyrannicide, regicide. He believed that it was lawful for people to kill the tyrant and the inadequate ruler. And so in Paradise Lost, a lot of various ideas are brought together, but a very powerful idea of Milton, among others, expressed in the text, is connected with the possibility of revolt against the existing system as represented by the God of the Old Testament. After Charles II received the throne and was restored, Milton was arrested for a while. By the time he was completely blind, and it was quite difficult for him to survive the confinement, and generally quite difficult for him to live. Then he was released from prison, but he spent the remaining years of his life in poverty, in dire state, and he died impecunious at the age of 66. But because of this powerful verse he wrote, he became popular during his lifetime, and he remained and remains popular up to now. It's very different from the Shakespearean tradition. It's quite different from what we had just seen in John Donne's texts. And for some people, it's not an easy reading, because the complicated structure of the text resembles that of so many Latin classic texts. And John Milton was not a person easily read. But again, though he is very different from his predecessors, he is the author of remarkable texts, and though some people may thoroughly dislike him for the complexity of his works, for others he is a brilliant author to be admired, cherished, and studied. So the idea of Paradise Lost, it's the fight of the rebellious angel against God. Also the story of Adam and Eve is introduced. And here in our handout, we have the examples of John Milton's powerful rhetoric. First, it's Satan addressing himself, thinking about the hopelessness of his situation, but at the same time suggesting that he should fight till the end. What though the field be lost? All is not lost. The unconquerable will and study of revenge, immortal hate and courage never to submit or yield, and what is else not to be overcome. That glory ne'er shall his wrath or might extort upon me, to bow and sue for grace with suppliant knee, and deify his power, who from the terror of this arm so late doubted his empire, that were low indeed, that were an ignominy and shame beneath this downfall. Since by fate the strength of gods and this imperial substance cannot fail, since through experience of this great event, in arms not worse, in foresight much advanced, we may with more successful hope resolve to wage by force or guile eternal war, irreconcilable to our grand foe, who now triumphs, and the excess of joy, sole reigning holds the tyranny of heaven. Satan is quite explicit, fighting the tyranny of heaven, fighting the tyranny the way John Milton did it during the whole of his life, the way he understood tyranny. A very different piece of text, lyrical, showing Eve's love to Adam and Adam's love to Eve. Complicated rhetorically, but not as complicated as the previous text, because in fact there are some repetitions. But it shows the difference in Milton's style, his capacity to write very moving and touching lines. Hopefully you will like it. Eve addressing Adam. To whom thus Eve with perfect beauty added, may also and dispose, what thou bidst, unargued I obey. So God ordains, God is thy law, thou mine. To know no more is woman's happiest knowledge and her praise. Такой demonstrate. Адам подчиняется Господу, а Ева подчиняется Адаму. У нее прямого подчинения Господу нет. И дальше лирические строки чрезвычайно популярны. With thee conversing, I forget all time, all seasons and their change, all please alike. Sweet is the breath of morn, her rising sweet, with charm of earliest birds. Pleasant the sun, when first on this delightful land he spreads his orient beams, on herb, tree, fruit, and flower, glistering with dew. Fragrant the fertile earth after soft showers, and sweet the coming on of grateful evening mild. Then silent night, with this her solemn bird, and this fair moon, and these the gems of heaven, her starry train. But neither breath of morn, when she ascends with charm of earliest birds, nor rising sun on this delightful land, nor herb, fruit, flower glistering with dew, no fragrance after showers, no grateful evening mild, no silent night with this her solemn bird, no walk by moon or glittering starlight, without thee is sweet. This text shows Milton's capacity to write very differently, to produce both emotional, lyrical texts and very powerful pieces of rhetoric. So the 17th century was not the best time for writers to work, simply because the censorship introduced by King James in 1613 disbarred the writers from publishing their texts for about 10 years. Then the period of King Charles I's reign followed. Theatre was still popular in the country, but people were getting increasingly uncomfortable because of the censorship which still survived. And then theatres, which were still the main sources of literary development, were closed in the country for about 18 years, since 1642, when the Civil War began, till the end of the 1650s. And so only with the Restoration did the theatres open and literature was renewed, but it was, of course, quite different from what it used to be some 50 years before this. And English authors were ready to follow French and Italian examples rather than developing their own literary traditions. And the Restoration theatre appeared. Shakespeare was included in the list of authors performed, but as again I had said it some time ago, Shakespeare's plays were shortened, they were censored, they were cleansed from the low type characters, and other genres began to proliferate, not only theatre, but poetic genres, and the names of John Dryden and Alexander Pope were most prominent among the list of authors who became popular in the second part of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century. Also, side by side with poetry, in the first part of the 18th century, the genre of the novel began to proliferate. Previously, it had not been taken seriously, and people who were doing literature professionally would be rather engaged in producing plays and lyrical texts. But then the period of novels began, and poetry as a genre was becoming less and less, if not significant, at least it stopped being the primary genre. And we know the names of Richardson, Fielding, Sterne, Smollett. Those are the great writers who worked for 40 years in the middle of the 18th century and who changed the English literary landscape forever. If we speak about poetry of the 18th century, of course, we should mention classicist writers like Alexander Pope, but it was not until the first part of the 19th century that poetry really began to proliferate in England yet again. The 18th century is famous for the names of people like Robert Burns, for example, and William Blake, one of them, the nationalist-oriented author, glorifying Scotland in his writings, creating texts in various genres, and the lyrical poems are predominant among them. And William Blake, in a sense, following John Donne's traditions, in a sense, displaying his own problematic mental state, became yet another maverick, very different from traditionalist-minded authors, who can be also included in the group of the so-called metaphysical poets, who is loved by some group of people with rather peculiar tastes, and who is not taken seriously by so many others who appreciate the classicist tradition first and foremost. So the 18th century writers were mainly writers of prose, those who remain in the literary history of the country. But the end of the 18th and the first part of the 19th century was the time of the revival of the English poetic tradition. And it would already be connected not with classicism, but with the appearance of a very powerful trend in literary history, Romanticism. Romantics were appearing, first of all, in Germany. They contributed a lot to writing poetic texts, to establishing specific genres, and to interpreting the poets of the previous epochs. The names of the people particularly well known are, of course, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Southey. If we speak about the elder generation, the older generation, and then we would have Byron, Shelley, Keats, and other important authors who continued the tradition of their predecessors and their foreign teachers, so to speak, and they introduced changes of their own in this romantic tradition, devoted yet again, not of course to Satan and to God of Milton's Paradise Lost, but still connected with the individual psychology of people, their individual feelings, their dissatisfaction with the present and their interest in the historical past, their refusal to obey the world around, and the characters of poems and the lyrical characters of the texts written by romanticists are very often not only opposed to society, but they are also ready to die fighting this society. And we have many analogies in the classic Russian literature of the poet of the period, because we know that both Pushkin, Lermontov, and many other authors followed the example of the English, who would follow the example of the Germans, and as a result, a very powerful trend within the literature of the 19th century would be created on the international level. Next time, we will continue our talk of the 18th and the 19th century poetry using some examples, which I will provide you with. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Bye.
Thank you, Doctor.